So Jean, what really started you writing about the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnons?
Well, I didn't start out with it. It's story-driven. I started out with an idea for a story of a young woman who was living with people who were different. And I didn't mean just different color hair or eyes or skin, but really something substantively different. But I didn't know that much about this period. But I started my Encyclopedia Britannica, and I discovered there was this time in our prehistory when there were literally two different kinds of humans living at the same time in the same place. And I thought, what an exciting idea to write about. And that's what got me started.
Yeah. So we're talking about the last ice age, maybe 25 to 30,000 years ago,
Yes.
towards the end of the time for the Neanderthals and modern humans coming into Europe, the Cro-Magnons.
Yes.
So your vision of them was obviously based on the research at that time. So we're talking the late 1970s maybe is when you were doing your first research?
Yes, and it was interesting because, you know, at that time, they were actually calling Neanderthal Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. And so it wasn't as, you know, it was later that they then got farther. There's, you know, this pendulum that we talk about, that as a new idea comes in, you sort of begin to modify. But that's part of the scientific process.
Sure, yes. I mean, this is it, keeping up to date. And obviously sometimes, I mean, from the scientific point of view, we have to sometimes say, if we're good scientists, well, we got it wrong. And then you sort of move on with the new data. In your case, obviously, you're moving the story of the people on. So it's a slightly different approach.
It's a different approach. Yeah. And as I've said before, a scientist tries to be objective. Tries to make sure the science is right.
Yeah.
A novelist needs to be subjective, needs to make you suspend your sense of disbelief, make you believe that this could all be true. So we have to get the people right, and we have to get the feelings right.
Yeah. And obviously you've portrayed the Neanderthals as very human in their own way, but a kind of different way of human.
In a different way, yeah.
And the key differences for you, if we can look at the differences, what would they be? Well,
first of all, one of the things that I looked up when I was, you know, trying to find out what they were, is I read, for example, Philip Lieberman's study from Brown University he measured modern humans, and he measured the bones of Neanderthal, and he measured other kinds of animals and so on, trying to see how much Neanderthal could articulate. And what he came up with is that he felt that there was some limitation in their ability to articulate. Now, maybe that's not the way it is now, but I think we don't really know. We can only go so far.
Some reconstructions now have Neanderthals with very high-pitched voices.
Yes.
So they probably were singing very nicely to each other.
Yeah, there was one book out that came about the singing Neanderthal.
That's right, yeah.
And, but we still don't know, you know. So since this is an area that we don't know for sure, as a novelist, I can paint it in. It's like a puzzle. I don't have to be as accurate as a scientist.
Yes, yeah.
But I try to be for everything that we know for sure.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. And what we don't know for sure, then I can make some guesses at.
Well, we've just published some work about behaviour that's about 15,000 years old, so it's after the time of your books, but the late Cro-Magnons. And people in Britain, in Somerset, were apparently eating each other, and they actually modified skulls to make drinking cups for ritual use. So is this something which has come into your books at all, that kind of complexity of behaviour?
Not quite to that extent, but I think that there was in the clan of the cave bear, there was a little bit of ritual behavior, you know. And I don't think that they were eating each other as for nutritional reasons. And that's often the way it is with modern, you know, when you read what the anthropologists say. Very often, if they were using cannibalism, it was because they wanted to get the power of the ancestors, the strength of their enemies, or something like that. They weren't really doing it because they were hungry.
It's more a tribute to the dead rather than you know, just doing it for food. In terms of the science, obviously the fate of the Neanderthals has been something I've been looking at for my whole career, so more than 30 years really, and we're still not there with the final answer, and we even know there's a bit of DNA in a lot of us alive today from Neanderthals, so they're not completely gone. But from your point of view, you know, what's your hunch on what happened to them physically, if not their DNA?
Well, I think it was not one thing. I think that there were several kinds of things that led to their demise. Some of it may have been climate. Although, you know, they lived through both warm and cold climates before that. So there's not necessarily any one thing that we know for sure.
Well, they were so widespread, they were in different environments, it's unlikely it's going to be the same thing everywhere. That's something I've thought for a long time. And I think as much as anything, they were probably unlucky, because we know now that the climate of Europe, when the Cro-Magnons arrived to live alongside the Neanderthals, it was one of the most unstable times in the Earth's climate of any of the last million years. And so I think the Neanderthals might well have, if it had been stable climate, they might still be here around today.
What have you found that has come up in the last few years?
Well, I think it's really part of this idea that Neanderthals are closer to us in some ways. So in Gibraltar, for example, you know, I excavated with Clive Finlayson and colleagues, and we found there evidence that Neanderthals were eating shellfish and even at times marine mammals.
Yes.
You know? So that was something which was, again, supposed to be a big difference, but they obviously varied in their behaviour, and down there they were eating Mediterranean things. And of course we've had research recently that shows that from the calculus on their teeth, the tartar, preserved in there on Neanderthals is evidence of processing starches and seeds and all of that stuff,
and
which I think you had in the books.
You know, I had them doing all of the, they weren't just eating meat, they were eating whatever was available in their environment.
Yeah. Over their whole range, certainly in the winter in Northern Europe, they'd have had to be reliant on meat, because you haven't got much in the way of plant
Unless they were
resources.
able to store some.
Okay, yes, if they're storing stuff and they've got access to underground tubers and roots, then they will have those available. But again, you may have snow over the ground, so finding them will be the problem there. But further south, they've got a much wider range of resources available to them. So the idea that there was just kind of one Neanderthal way or one Cro-Magnon way is clearly wrong.
I think you're right there.
We know now that Neanderthals actually covered a very big area. They were down in Gibraltar, in Britain at times, even at times over in Siberia, certainly in the Middle East. Moderns came into that area probably from the Middle East and then started to head westward. So they obviously did overlap at various times in various places. So from your point of view, you set your books really in the European area.
Yeah, the first book was set in the Crimea, where there were Neanderthal caves. And then of course we keep moving west, and we end up in France, where there were both Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon. And I think the fact that they overlap was, to me, the most exciting thing.
And in terms of the big question of interbreeding, now obviously I've been addressing that one for many years, and I've never thought that interbreeding, even if they were different species, I'm sure interbreeding could have happened, but I most recently tended to think it was pretty trivial in the big picture. But obviously the DNA shows that many of us have 2.5% Neanderthal DNA in us. But of course you had interbreeding in there right from the beginning, didn't you?
Right from the beginning, but it was also not a lot. Okay, you're the scientist, and you're the ones that I go to for my information. Where do you think it's going to go next?
Well, I think the DNA work is obviously having a huge impact. There'll always be new fossil discoveries and archaeology discoveries, but the DNA is really pushing on. I mean, the advances of the last 10 years, you couldn't have imagined them 10 years ago, that we have most of a Neanderthal genome. And
we didn't even imagine we could get a genome.
Exactly. Yes. I mean, you know, when we were both starting out writing, it was science fiction purely that there'd be any Neanderthal DNA. Now we've got most of a genome, and again, 5 years ago I would have said we're never going to clone a Neanderthal, and we certainly shouldn't do it. But now people are saying, well, actually, you know, in the not too distant future, technically it will be possible. I personally hope it's never done. I think I'd rather be studying the remains of the Neanderthals and not a living one. Yes. But I don't know.
But it would be interesting.
Yeah.
It would be a tremendous learning experience for us.
Yeah. It's a very tricky question, but it's one we may have to face up to one day.
One day.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been great talking to you, Jean.
Well, it's been great to see you again, too. I was so delighted when I found that you were going to be here, and we have a chance to talk.
Thanks very much.